Hello, everyone. You want to see the screen, so sit closer to me or somewhere around the TVs, because we will be playing a quiz. So it will be great. Disclaimer, it's the first time I did a presentation a week before the conference, and I may not remember of the slides, so I know I shouldn't do it in the future. Just kidding, of course. So today I really wanted to talk to you about breaking bad code. It's actually a topic that I'm working on a daily basis, because we're doing the modularization of a very, very large monolithic system. So happy to discuss with you during the after party or during the coffee break. What does it mean? And we see quite a lot of interesting situations that happened to the code. And I really wanted to tell you how we can approach such situations. So we will be talking about a couple of interesting ideas. Okay, good stuff. For those of you who don't know me, this is my dog, and this is me, of course. I'm working as a head of engineering for Revolut Business. So if you're using Revolut Business, something doesn't work for you, you know who to tweet. If it's Revolut Retail, I can only pass it. Just kidding. There is a Revolut booth. You can talk to us. It's a very interesting company. I have to say, I really wanted to choose the next company that hyperscales. So be careful what you wish for, because since I joined a year and a half, it doubled the number of users. So the problems are really interesting. And this presentation will be also about these problems. Enough of Revolut. That's it. Okay, so what do I want to talk to you about today? First of all, I will do a quick intro, a simulation of what happens if when the product owner comes to us and talks to us about what should we do. I will tell you about how simple problems can turn into complicated solutions, and what do we do to make it fun, make the project fun. So we'll talk about anti-patterns. That's where I need an interaction. I know some of you are after lunch, so I will be screaming if needed, okay? Then we'll talk about why some of the principles that stand behind the programming paradigms that we're using on a daily basis. And I will convince you, by the way, this is like a conference where DDD is back, because I think there are 4 talks at least that I counted about the DDD. So I sense some kind of renaissance. My talk will be also about DDD a little bit. And then the quick conclusion. Good stuff. So I need to set up the scene. This is Breaking Bad, so guess what will be the theme of the presentation, right? So, product owner comes to our team and says, we want to do approval request. So imagine a situation where you have a system and you have users with different, there is a hierarchy, there are user rights. And what we want to do, basically speaking, is create a system where I want to do something and I need to ask somebody for approval. So in case of the business bank, it might be that I need to ask my boss whether I can order another card or make a payment, right? So approval request is created. We asked about, okay, so dear product owner, what are some of the specifics that you can give us? And he says, oh, for example, transfers below £1,000, get automatic approval, but transfer above the threshold need to be authorized, right, or approved. They say any functionality in the future may require an approval. This is a very important sentence, of course, because it will lead us to do a lot of magic. Okay, so this is the scene. Hands up if you created anything like that. That's a very generic domain. It's quite often happens in the system that you have to raise a ticket for something. Okay, good stuff. So you will know where I'm heading. But what do we do? We make it fun, right? So we set up the Git repo and we start coding. And now I will show you code snippets and I will ask you what kind of anti-pattern do you see. So we'll have a little bit of fun. First one. It's better to see it on the TV, so I will read it. We, in one of the first commits we had, MongoDB config, we add user repository, extending Mongo repository, we have a Kafka config, etc., etc. So what is the anti-pattern? Come on, don't be shy. No bad answers. They don't have name. I made them up, to be honest. So, Nina. Not quite. So let me help you with a quote from our theme. So, what do we do? There is a good saying that if there is no fun in the project, we'll make it fun for ourselves, right? And the other anti-pattern is premature technology decisions. It's a very simple domain. So what have we done? We did CV-driven development, right? So we want to make sure that we have certain technologies in our CVs. It happens very often in greenfield projects and in startups. This time, it will be beautiful. We'll use Mongo, etc., Kafka, and whatever. Remember, that was we only started the project, right? So basically speaking, choosing such technology stack before solving the problem is asking for problems, right? So we do that all the time, and we love it as a profession. So that's the first anti-pattern. Second, what can we do? Very, very quickly. My God, ask for what is the system? What it should do? What is the scale at the moment? Why do we want to grow it in the future, and how sure are we of that? Why? What are the data requirements, like GDPR compliance, for instance, etc., etc., etc. So that's what we can do. Okay. Then, code snippet number 2. We created approval. And if you cannot see it, we have a lot of properties. We added some getters and setters. There is also, so there are quite a lot of them. Another quote from our TV series. So do you know what I'm talking about with such code? What could happen? Getters and setters in entities. I know some of you will hate me for it, but wait for it. So we see that often in the data-centric approach, when we focus on the data, not the behavior. We only treat the entities as some structures of data, and we save them in the database. The whole logic is somewhere around. So this is a really interesting problem. What does it lead to? First thing that I saw is that the logic is scattered all over the application, including the clients, funnily enough, right? So you exposed fully your entities. I can do anything that I want with them. I can manipulate them, I can get whatever I want from them, etc., etc. I've seen also a business logic in the integration layer, right? So where it shouldn't be done at all. Why? Because it was easy, convenient, etc., etc. That leads to very interesting problem that causes us to burn out and put the resignation letter. Meaning, lack of understanding what really happens, debugging bugs, being pushed for solving them, and burning out very, very quickly. So, and it's also a testing nightmare. Good stuff. The next one. So, I've got something like that. What can be wrong with that? It's all good, right? So what is the problem? Okay. Auto-generate getters and setters. That's a big issue. Why? We just did exactly what I described, but we auto-generated that, right? That's a very common scenario if we trust ORM frameworks. We just say, this is my data container, make it available to everyone. And we have very different, interesting methods generated. But wait for it, coming soon to your solution is anemic domain models. We ask for that. We don't have any behavior in our entities. That's just a container, nothing else. And that really weakens the cohesion of the domain model, meaning that the logic is spread all over it. And it will be even harder to understand and maintain the solution. Okay, if you like the game, let's talk about another one. So what I've done here. Also, I have to say, unfortunately, that it can be seen quite often. Okay, let me just give you a hint. And we just fully expose our entities in the API. Of course, that would be continued. So we would have all of the entities exposed in the API. What is the problem with such an approach? If you're doing CRUD system, that's fine, okay? It's, you're really building API to your database, nothing else. But the problem is, if you have some interesting business logic, that will result in multiple problems for you very, very soon. So you will have a very tight coupling because between what you were supposed to have as a domain model, API contracts, and your client contracts. So everything is intertangled. And any change now to anything will require changing everything, right? So this is the problem that you asked for. Any modification to your entities will break the integrations very easily. And very careful, you may overexpose a lot of information with this approach, right? So if you connect, or for instance, auto-generating all of the getters and setters, then exposing it to through the API, you ask for a lot of trouble. And you're begging for inconsistent states with this approach as well, because something will be able to set your state. We'll come back to states in a moment. Okay, another code snippet. Oh, come on. What's wrong with it? Would you approve such a PR? Why? Could be double, yeah. But that's not the problem. Oh, closer, much closer, much closer. I've seen this too often. Business logic in getters and setters. Why? That's not the role for the getter or setter. That's not the role how you should. That's not the way you should really code your methods, right? So what we're doing here, we're just asking for trouble because somebody is thinking that sets an amount. But what it really does, it does a lot of things. Among them, in some cases, it will set this amount, right? So that's one of the case problems that we have, and it's not uncommon. I was really surprised how often do we see that, and it's very especially common in the system which are data-centric designs. So be careful of that. So that's very often happens when we want to protect the entity state. So really, this kind of enforce these business rules that we usually talk about, right? Like I shown you just on the previous slide, for instance, where the amount is something, right? But that's not the role of getters and setters. So, what it will lead to? First of all, it will lead to hidden side effects. So, you debug the application, you have a bug in the production, everything is burning. You search for the problem, and there it is. Something happens in the setter. How the hell would you expect that? It's really hard to understand the code. When you read it, you really don't understand what's going on. This is a simple example. It can be very much harder, and it violates all of the things that you're being asked on the coding interview. So why do we do it, by the way? Okay, another one that we often see. This is like, hands up if your system has an entity called user. Oh, come on. More. Like, come on, every system has a user, right? That's the first thing that we create in our database. There is a user. But the problem here is we keep adding stuff to this user. So, of course, what it is, the anti-pattern. This one has a name, and it's very official, right? God entity, right? So we just created a bloated, amazingly bloated thing that does everything at once. Of course, here is a very simple example, but what you see usually in a system that have something, God entities, is there will be a long list of responsibilities. And you know what's coming, right? There will be a customer and so on and so forth. And what they do? They do everything. They're responsible for everything. They make our life easier, right? We just add something to the user, and that's it. But the problem is, it will become a massive thing to maintain. The responsibilities will be not clear. So whose bug is it? Are you doing the git blame per line then and trying to understand who introduced the change to your God entity that is shared between 5, 6, 10, 15, 50 teams? It will introduce massive coupling. So that's a very interesting problem when you have such entities. You will very soon need to talk to everyone in the company very quickly, because the changes, let's say we want to change anything. It will result in performance issues, and it's among a lot of other things. It definitely violates, for instance, single responsibility principle. But there is a thing that follows that I saw in many projects, but it's very rarely talked about. So it's not very clear from the code, but let's say you have then a concept that needs to work with God entity. What do? Product owner and business talks about a concept, for instance, an action that requires an approval, but then you do some magic in the code. So I would call it concept generalization to support God entities. So we do the reverse what we should do. In other words, instead of making the code to follow the business rules and the business processes, we make concepts to follow especially the God entities. So of course, we have the user, I don't know, another thing, a customer, etc., etc. And when we need to do something with them, we say, oh, that's not possible, but we can do it this way, by the way. What will be the problem? Oh yeah, sorry. It's very quickly. It happens when we try to simplify on standardize the domain model, and we make the model very shallow because we need to actually generalize the concepts in to make sure that we support these God entities that actually are scattered across the whole system. What is coming very quickly? If you do this is very dangerous, and I saw that in many projects. You will lose a lot of nuances of your domains. You will ask to actually do a lot of hacks and tweaks to support these systems and cases. At some point, you will be patching the patches. So it's that bad. It will be very hard and difficult to understand what you're really doing. It will be leading to bugs, because what you have in the code and what people think the code does will be totally different two things. And of course, you will need to do a translation between them. Okay. This should be simple. So, what is here? That as well, I guess. So, the tip was inconsistency in naming. Okay, that is Boolean flags and properties. Asking for trouble, big time. And yet, we love it. So, what I saw, it very often starts with one single Boolean flag, disabled, or to be terminated. So We have users, right? We will disable them. But then it comes out that, for instance, an approval or the user will have to be in other states. Okay, so we have disabled. That's it. Another and another and another flag. Hands up if you've seen it in the code in the last 6 months. Don't be shy. Oh God, I didn't know that, it's so common. So we ask for trouble, big time. So Boolean flags limit the representation of the state, right? You really don't know what is the state, especially like you have 6, 10, 15 of these Boolean flags. And there are systems which have them. So that is asking for trouble. Impossible and illegal states. Impossible meaning, how the hell did we end up here? Illegal, oh shit, it shouldn't work like that. So that's very common what it happens. And of course, it makes it really hard to understand what is the true state. Like, you can probably draw some diagram. If this and that, then the state is this. So probably that's how you end up debugging this. And it breaks the finite state machine concept, meaning your entity can be in one state and the time. It cannot have two states. It's not yet probably there, right? Okay, another one. So we have all of the getters and setters, again, and something interesting happens here. We expose the internal state fully, right? We open the door. We briefly talked about that, and we ask for the trouble, especially if we expose this through the API. Now, have you seen any of those? Hands up, I need to wake you up. Okay, we work in the same profession then. Good stuff. So, now turning back, what can we do? So first and foremost, that's a Java conference. So if you've seen that, you should be using OOP. And it's really interesting for me because in OOP, we misunderstood a lot of it, and we focus on the wrong things. So I would see, for instance, PRs talking about classes structure and discussions about private fields, getters, setters, but missing the one important point. And there is really one point about OOP. It's about capture and encapsulate the behavior. Happy to be challenged. But this is the true reason why we actually use talking about OOP. I will repeat: capture and encapsulate the behavior. So what all of the bad patterns that you've seen broke this in some way, right? So in some cases, really hard way. So what can you do to encapsulate the behavior? First of all, you really need to do something that that requires probably talking to people, but we really need to understand the requirements. So rules, what changes when, who can change it, can it change once again? If it changes twice, if we do this action twice, is the result the same? Can all of the users do it, and so on and so forth. So you really want to understand the rules and constraint. So when something definitely cannot happen or cannot change, right? So you really want to understand all of them. And some of these concepts are have really interesting nuances. So when you start to talk to the business, like about approvals that we shown, there will be multiple interesting nuances that you really need to capture. If you don't capture it well, that will be scattered all over the place, and you will have to live with it and debug it. You really want to build the language for your domain. You don't need to use the JDD. If you don't want to use it, just call it glossary, for God's sake, really. And capture the glossary. And make sure that you use the glossary from the conversations with the business stakeholders, through your code, through your possibly data systems if you can, and the reporting. the great way to really make this language shared is to make sure that you capture it all over the way and you report on exactly using the same language. If you're happy to use JDD, and there are a lot of talks following one as well, that will be called ubiquitous language, meaning that's the language that you want to share with everyone. If I say approval, everyone should understand it exactly in the same way. If I say this approval is rejected by this rule, the idea is everyone understands approval, rejected, rule, and this rule, right? So that's the whole concept. We don't need to translate our concepts and play the Chinese whispers. And if you're doing any project from now on, I would really recommend start with domain model. It's very simple, a few classes. You don't need to use JDD, by the way, but you can start with the domain model and really encapsulate in behavior using your OP, whatever you call it. But I will talk about JDD a little bit. So how to learn it? So we know what to do, how to learn more. It's not the talk about that, but there are strategic tools that you can use, right? Domain storytelling. It's very easy, very simple, makes even very hard, complex domains to really understand them. Second, very useful is event storming. So I truly recommend it. If you haven't tried it, it's really a lightweight tool. You can really customize it to your needs, to your team, to whatever they're used to. And my way of talking about complex problems is really visualize it. Visualize it. Are we aligned? Are we sure that this is exactly what we mean by approval, rejection, and so on and so forth? Event modeling is another one, but really, anything that works for your team. If going for a dinner and chatting about something works for your team, just do it. Make sure that you capture everything and you describe it in whatever way. Then start to build the solution once you have it. I would recommend make sure that it's fully protected and isolated. So it asks for, of course, certain architecture patterns. We'll touch on it, but really make sure that nothing leaks in to your domain. There will only be the behavior of your entities, right? Behavior of your concepts. What it gives us: tests are super simple and easy to understand. If you've seen any of the anti-patterns that I'm showing you, most likely the only test that will give you a full coverage, like a logical full coverage, will be the function test on the API level or end-to-end test, because that's the only way you can actually test the whole scattered logic, which is all over the place, including the database. Otherwise, if you follow this this concept that I want to talk to you about, it will be much simpler and easier to understand that. And you can of course utilize clean, onion, hexagonal architecture concepts, or whatever works for you, I would say. By the way, what is the difference between onion and clean? That's a question to wake you up. But I really I sometimes got to these discussions in the after party, and we asked the ChatGPT with a good friend. The only thing is naming conventions and the authors of the concepts. So there are some nuances, but actually that's really how it works. Good stuff. But we can introduce domain-driven design, tactical patterns. It will help you. So, and by the way, from my experience, you don't probably need or want to use the full tool suite. Use the tools from the JDD toolbox that will work for you. So it will already help you. So first of all, value object. Easy, immutable, doesn't have identity, and equality is based on the state and on the properties, right? So £1,000 equals £1,000, unless we're in the banknote tracking domain. So that's simple. And you will have a lot of concepts in your domains like that. So for instance, in approval, a rule can be, for instance, a value object, right? Because a rule would be probably required, I don't know, maybe a required seniority level. It might require certain certain roles and permissions in our system, certain properties. So one rule with the other with the same properties and the state will be exactly the same. So that's the one that is very, very useful. Very easy to model the concepts with value objects. So this is, for instance, the implementation of the money. So typical book implementation of the money. Entity. So entity in domain-driven design is the thing that has identity. So one entity with one identity will be its own thing, and another ID will be its own thing, right? It will be mutable, meaning it will be a life cycle. So the concepts that have a life cycle automatically are good candidates for entities in your domain, right? So in other words, an approval would be, in our case, modeled as entity. So somebody raises the approval request, somebody reviews it, accepts it or not, there might be some automatic rules, etc., etc. So there will be a life cycle of the entity, and it will be mutable. They fully encapsulate state-dependent behavior, same as value objects, and same as value objects that represent concepts purely from the problem domain that we work with. So he will be, for instance, an approver. So a person that can approve, for instance, approval request in our system. Aggregate. I mean, if you already use, I should add, if you already use value objects and entities, you're already in a good place. You can start thinking about aggregates. So basically speaking, a cluster of domain objects that have their own, that we treat as a single unit. So for instance, in our case, that can be an approval. And in approval, usually there will be one entity, meaning our approval, for instance, which actually changes the state of its own like objects tree, right? So I change anything about approval only through the approval. Even if you talk to approval entity, even if you talk to the business, it will be exactly, if you listen to the requirements, very often they will guide you what should be the aggregates and what should be protecting the rules, for instance, right? So that's exactly why we call it the aggregate. There should be probably another talk about aggregate, because there are a lot of discussions how to design good aggregates. I would say try, check if it works for you. There are certain rules where where definitely the aggregates can, for instance, some heuristics which will tell you that you can probably rearrange things. And yep, then basically speaking, the aggregate will be responsible for consistency of all of the changes. So here is, for instance, our approval. And everything, for instance, an action to approve will be done only through the approval, even if it changes state of its own entities that belong to approval. For instance, if it changes the state of the approval request that is inside. What problems do we solve if we approach like the problem like this? First of all, we encapsulate the behavior and the data together. So there is no more problem that the logic is scattered all over the place. There is only one place, the domain model, where where all of the changes will live, right? So it makes it very easy to understand what's going on. It makes it very easy to test. It's very very easy to then extend the model from my perspective. So if you follow the rules, and they're not very hard to follow, to be honest, it should always represent the problems and the concepts from your domain, meaning from, for instance, approval. And we make sure that all controls and are consistently followed in their boundaries. So most of the problems that we've seen will be solved. Now, a couple of additional DDD patterns that will help you. Domain events. So they're very helpful if you really want to track changes to your domain. So basically speaking, it's a concept where you really want to represent the changes of the state. You start to represent the transitions in the domain, and you want to observe them for whatever reason, for instance, integration as well, but that's you don't use domain events for that, you translate them, but they're very, very helpful for that. They will also be helpful to understand the history of the change. We'll come back to that. So for instance here, a typical event in DDD would be, for instance, payment request approved. So for instance, when I approve a payment request, there is such an event that will be created. Domain services. So when using DDD, you will come across concepts that can span multiple entities, multiple aggregates, and they not naturally lie within the boundaries of any of them. So it will come naturally. So you will have, for instance, this discussion during a PR, whether it's approval or whether it's an approval request. If you cannot make or for instance, maybe that's not ideal example, but especially a couple of aggregates. And when you have this discussion, it's a very good heuristic that most likely you're discussing about a domain service. A domain service is basically speaking a concept where it doesn't have a state. It orchestrates some actions between a number of aggregates together. So, and they represent the problem from the domain. And usually they will be they will contain a typical action. In our case, it might be approval service that performs an approval with approval and the approver, if we modeled it like that, right? So this is a typical approval service. Okay, good stuff. So here we are, a very different payment approval, cleaned up of the stuff that we didn't like. All of the behavior is encapsulated. Only the behavior, like the possible actions and the behavior, are exposed to the external world in the methods. We don't expose anything else. Clean, easy, very crisp. What is going on, very clear, very easy to understand, and of course then make sure that we extend it. Okay, good stuff. What is the, okay, so we build a domain model. Now the problem is how to expose it to the external world. And there are different ways. I would say if you want to start small, my proposition would be follow the application service layer. So basically speaking, this is your orchestration for whenever you have an action that you can perform, it orchestrates getting data for this action, additional data for this action. It triggers the domain model, performs the action on the domain model, gets the model state, and persists the state, and returns the result, right? So it's really orchestration of the logic. In this way, we delegate all of the business rules, all of the calculations, all of the checks for permissions, etc., to the domain model, where it's most likely that it should lie there. And we make sure that ideally implemented one should have one-to-one mapping with the concepts, cases and tasks in the system, meaning the functionalities that we want to expose. And here is an example of the approval application service. So we have some kind of repository, some event dispatcher. We get, for instance, a request to approve. We have approval ID, approver ID. We get them from the repositories. We pass them to the domain model. We execute the action of approve. and we save the state. This is a simplified code, but basically speaking, that's how we do work. And for instance, we can additionally, a nice thing to do is use unit of work to dispatch the events. So that can be done like that. Okay, how to expose it then to the external world? Then comes integration layer. And what would be the beauty if we follow our rules so far would be that the only thing we do is we trigger concrete cases from the approvals from the application service. So it's very easy to understand what is going on, and that of course will be very, very thin layer, only exposing what it's a couple of functionalities. A thing that you can borrow from the JDD that can help you, especially if you want, if you integrate with a number of services, that's the case that we have as well, is publish language. So basically speaking, the question is, okay, you have your certain concepts, but you need to integrate with other systems, and you may actually have quite a complex domain language, or your own, you really want to have your own consistent domain language, but you want to have a public API that everyone in the company can use. And maybe you don't want to share the details for whatever reason of your domain. Or maybe you're exposing a public API and you don't want to expose the concepts of from your domain on purpose. So that's where you use publish language. So basically speaking, what it really does, it will translate the naming conventions that you have in your domain model to some common language that you agree with the whole company. So let's say we have somewhere, let's call it user management, right, in our company, and we have some sort of roles and permissions. That's a very complex domain sometimes, and the whole complexity will be hidden in the domain, but in the API we would see much simpler conventions, right? And that's also the way to protect ourselves from God entities in the larger systems. So, common language that everyone in the company or outside can use, consistency, and then interoperability comes with it for free. Okay, so here is the example. So if you have a DTO that is used to integrate, that's most likely actually already a published language in practice. So there will be a translation between our model and the DTO. Another concept that comes very handy is event sourcing. So very often when project starts, we start with basically speaking a Cradle-like approach where we store the current state and that's pretty much it. But sometimes in some of the domains, it might be much more helpful to actually understand the history. For instance, the logic of the domain may require the history of the changes as well. What you could do is probably you can do some hacks and store some additional information, et cetera, et cetera. But you can at the same time use event sourcing, and it's not the easiest pattern, by the way. Because it comes with its own problems, but definitely you will have auditability, simplicity, and resilience out of it. Plus, as I described, some of your domain logic may require actually going through the previous states of your entities. So here would be an example that all of the history would be stored in an event store, and then loaded from the event store and aggregated to your current state. Okay, so we, as I said, from my experience, you don't probably need to use all of them. So there is no such a flavor as full DDD project. You can use whatever you need from the toolbox. So learn about the toolbox, learn about these concepts. It will help you to clean up all of the anti-patterns that we saw and clean up some of the problems that you face. So What we had, we really had we saw some of the anti-patterns. So premature technology decisions. So of course Kafka, Mongo, whatever you use for the win and for your CV. We saw the misuse of all of the getters and setters, exposing the state and asking for trouble because anyone can change anything. Anything about getters and setters and Boolean properties. So anyone can set the state to anything very quickly. We talked about God entities, so things that we don't know where to put it, so we'll put it there because it's convenient. And this thing spans over the system very, very quickly. And we talked about exposing internal state. So from my perspective, this is really lack of understanding of object-oriented programming principles. What we can do, first of all, understand your domain. So behavior, constraints, rules, etc., etc. Embrace the principles of OOP and domain-driven design. And use well-structured design with whatever layers work for you. So I won't tell you this is the way to go. No. There might be different ways, different architecture patterns that you can that you want to use. But definitely, I would say, get to know some of the tactical patterns, when to use them, and then consider additional architectural concept. Event sourcing is one of them, but there are definitely some more. What do you get from it? The software will be easier to understand, all right? You have explicitly naming conventions that everyone uses, the glossary that we spoke about. Therefore, it will be easier to maintain. If a product owner asks for a change, it will be much easier then. Or if we have a bug, it will be much easier to fix it because you have explicit code. And it will be, thanks to that, it's actually how we make the code evolvable, yes. So that's the way to do it. It definitely has a higher quality. Why? It's so much easier to test. So you don't need to think about these tweaks and hacks, how to test the whole thing that you build. It's actually, if you decompose it and encapsulate the domain logic in the domain model, these are unit tests. Very easy, very simple, very fast. You will develop features faster. So you need to invest some time in the beginning, but then it's very, very easy. If most of the teams will be using the same principles, same patterns, you will also know what to expect in other teams' code. So that's another beauty as well. Plus, from my experience, you work with a happier team. Why? Because some of these bugs that we talked about will no longer happen, or it will be much easier to fix. Therefore, it will be much more explicit, meaning less work on bugs, more work on building the stuff. For me, at least, it's a happier team. I think there are some teams that love to actually add yet another database, yet another message broker. The question is, what makes people happy? If that makes you happy, then fine, right? But from my perspective, that's usually end up really, really bad. So, additional materials that I really recommend. Domain-driven design was really hard to some point, and everyone who wanted to learn it, everyone was told, here's a blue book, you need to read it. So Eric Evans. And I would say, ask anyone who read it, including gurus in the JDD, about some of the concepts. Hello. That are described in the book. It will come out. There is a lot of discussions because Eric did probably well, that's first of all, the book is 20 years old, and he formulated some of the concepts then. And Władek Kononov, you could meet him in some of the conferences in Poland this year, wrote the book Learning Domain-Driven Design. And that's probably the best introduction to domain-driven design. If you want to de-dust your skills, I would definitely recommend this book. And it's a very smooth introduction, going through quite modern concepts as well, because the book, I think, is 2 years old. So if you want to get on top of some of these concepts that we discussed, get this book. super easy to read. Then, don't take the blue book yet. I would say, take this one. It's quite large, but it talks about really nicely about some patterns, principles, and practices. So builds really your toolbox. So all of the toolbox that we discussed, you can build with the really nicely with this book. By the way, this is Java conference. This book is in C#, so it's easy for you to read, and you may at least smile sometimes when you see the code, right? But I would say, this book is takes every concept and goes through it very thoroughly. It gives you a set of different examples from the strategic JDD to tactical, including event-driven architecture and event sourcing. So it's a really great book. Then read some other books to see with some of the additional nuances. Funny enough, this is Java conference, but I will say, the best book so far, if you really want to learn about basics of the architecture, happy to be challenged, is Architecture Patterns with Python. So somehow, Python engineers wrote a really good book on the architecture that is evolvable, easy to maintain, easy to work on, with domain-driven design concepts, event-driven architecture, and quite a lot of chapters on test-driven development. So, funnily enough, I would say, yeah, go for it. It's a really good read. And before we go, I wanted to invite you, because that's my and my friend's initiative. So, if you haven't listened to or joined our meetings, I really wanted to invite you to our CTO morning coffee, or we do also CTO brew. Basically speaking, it's our initiative for people who want to be engineering leaders. So if you want to share some concepts or ask about some concepts, I would say Sebastian and Tomek are really seasoned managers, and usually people who join us are for our conversations are well-respected experts in their areas. So we try to do an initiative by leaders for leaders, because we thought there is no such a thing. So it would be lovely if you can join us. So LinkedIn, Twitter, and CTO Morning Coffee. With that, you can rate my talk here. Great seeing you. And I don't know how much time have we got. We are out of time, but maybe you have questions. I will be around somewhere getting a coffee. Good stuff. Thank you.